Well, hello everybody and welcome back. I expected to have this video up and running last week, but things have been a little nutty, so it's taken me a bit to get to this. So I wanted to get into the trauma response. I know last video it talked about our last lecture we had talked about ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, what that was and how that applies to our everyday lives and those around us. So today I want to get into really when we talk about not just stress or adverse childhood experiences, but when it turns into a traumatic event. And trauma is anything that kind of, stops us in our tracks. It's those things that basically change the trajectory of the lives that we're living. And many people, some war veterans and things, people who've experienced extreme trauma, really are impacted for the rest of their lives. So we're going to get into what is trauma, what is the trauma response when it comes to our neurobiological responses, and what does that look like? And we'll kind of let it flow from there. So we'll see how far we get into this one. And if it gets a little too long, we might chop it up and put it in a different one. So I like to start these lectures with, at least the trauma lectures, with an example of a bear. Okay. So normally I would play a little video. I'll just tell you this story. I've adapted it from a different story that I heard. But let's say, for instance, we'll take myself as an example. I'm walking down the street one day, and I'm having a good time. I'm listening to the birds. Everything's great. Taking a little walk, and I pass this big bush next to me on this path, and I'm walking along, and I hear this crackle in the bush next to me, and a giant bear pops out. Right. So my entire system, right? It's what we call the autonomic nervous system, goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And these are not the same system. It's part of the same system. So the autonomic nervous system is part of the central nervous system, right? It's what we call it's on the periphery. And under the autonomic nervous system are two mechanisms, right? The parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is where we get our fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system is when we're faced with something extreme. Adrenaline just flows through our body. Adrenaline is the hormone. It's part of the endocrine system. It's a hormone that just rushes through our fluids. It rushes through our blood, right? So when it comes to adrenaline, we all know it. We all feel it. It's that thing that gets us ready to either, right, I'm going to fight the big bear or I'm going to run away really, really fast. That's the fight or flight system. That's the sympathetic nervous system. So I'm face to face with big bear and my system goes haywire. It not only triggers the sympathetic nervous system into fight or flight, it also triggers the parasympathetic nervous system into freeze, or beyond that, what we call collapse or folding. So I know there's another mechanism I'll briefly touch on. It's called fawning. Fawning is sort of a long-term reaction that happens, and it happens automatically, but we can often trace this back to something called child abuse accommodation syndrome. Child abuse accommodation syndrome happens early on in childhood. And if you've grown up in an abusive situation, that can trigger this mechanism into, okay, I'm going to do whatever is necessary just to survive to the next minute. And that usually means appeasing whoever the aggressor is, making sure that they're accommodated with anything they need, because survival is the name of the game. So that is a groomed and conditioned situation, and we often place this in the fawning category. But we're not going to get into any more of the fawning, I don't think, in this video. But when it comes to freeze, the parasympathetic nervous system, this is going on at the same time that the sympathetic nervous system is happening. So in the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, adrenaline, we've got epinephrine, and the thing is there's different systems that are going off, right? The endocrine system pumping hormones, the neurological system, right, is firing off all of these neurons, and these neurological chemical and electrical impulses are happening. All of these things are firing in the brain and throughout the body. the fight or flight is again the adrenaline, the epinephrine, all of those things are happening, gets my body ready to move. And then the freeze, the parasympathetic nervous system releases cortisol. It calms everything down. This is what we often see is people in extreme forms of trauma who typically will go into the freeze response. If they continue to stay in that response, they begin to what we call collapse or fold, and their internal organs will actually start to shut down. So this is where we see individuals who are faced with extreme trauma or extreme events may defecate or urinate on themselves because their organs are starting to shut down. This is where we see, you know, that playing dead kind of thing. It decreases your heart rate, your respiration, your blood pressure. It literally just, you know, your system saying just pretend like you're not living anymore, you know, so they'll go away. The problem is we have both of these systems happening at the same time. So, and they're in conflict with one another. They're not complementing one another. We have adrenaline that says, you know, we're going to fight Big Bear. We're going to run away really, really fast. And the freeze system says we're going to play dead, and you know, hopefully he'll leave us alone that way. So one is the gas pedal, the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system, and one is the brake. That is the freeze response, parasympathetic nervous system. So when you've got the brake and the gas going on at the same time, basically you're going nowhere. But you're flooding your system with hormones, with stress hormones. You're flooding your system with all of these neurological impulses. So you're face to face with Big Bear and you've got all of these things happening. And let's say, for instance, right, I'm there, bear's in front of me. And let's say I freeze. Now, typically, you will continue to sort of adapt to the same kind of survival response that you did as a child. So if you were a fighter, you know, chances are that's going to be your go-to, and it's automatic. It's not like you have, you know, too much of a choice. But it's part of those connections that were wired really early on. So, but let's say that I freeze and I go into collapse, right? So, face to face with Big Bear, my system goes into collapse. And let's say I pee myself, because let's be honest, I probably would. It's a big freaking bear. So face to face with Big Bear, he comes up and goes, "Oh my gosh, that's so gross." Right. And he runs away. Yay. I just survived my first bear attack. Awesome. So Big Bear is gone. My system still got a crap ton of stress hormones floating through it, right? So it's still got cortisol, still have adrenaline, still have all of these things happening. It's beginning to calm down, and it might take my system several hours. It might take several days, maybe even weeks to kind of come back to a balanced state of hormones and electrical impulses where I'm not on edge or hypervigilant. But let's say, for instance, you know, it takes me about a month to go, okay, I'm going to go for another walk. I'm going to take a different route. I'm going to go to a different park, right? So I'm walking and it's a really pretty wooded path and I got my earbuds on and everything's good. And I pass a big bush and I hear a crackle in the bush, right? My system automatically, bear. It's going to go into that same reaction that it did when the bear was actually there. But this time it's just a cat. Maybe it's the wind, nothing at all. Maybe it was because I saw the bush and heard it, but it really wasn't there. Something in my environment triggered me into a survival response. And it wasn't intentional. It wasn't something that was thought about. It just happened. That's what we call a PTSD response, right? So that is, you know, something in my environment triggered that reaction in my body. There was no forcing it to happen or not happen. It just what it was. So this is, again, this is what we see happen when it comes to the survival response. One of the interesting things is as we go throughout our day, right, everything that we see, hear, taste, touch, feel, all of our emotions, all of these things really get processed through what we call our implicit memory. Our implicit memory are those things that we don't know unless we choose to remember them. or that we have some useful purpose for them. So implicit memory is not the same as your unconscious or subconscious. Your unconscious, so unconscious, sort of, if you visualize this ball of memory, right? So you've got your consciousness, you've got your unconscious, and then within your unconscious are sort of like these boxes of implicit memory. Implicit means I didn't know that I knew it until something triggered it to come out. And that's often where our traumatic memories are stored, but it's also where all of that useless information is stored throughout the day until we go to sleep. And during, I believe it's that no, not REM sleep. It's might it be Anyway, I'll have to look it up, but there's I think it's beta waves or something. It's when we actually get into that level of sleep where we're sort of dead to the world, like literally, like nothing's waking us up. That's where memory from the day before starts to process and integrate into what we call explicit memory. Explicit memory are those things that we can recall, or the things that are in our conscious awareness. So it's part of the unconscious and it's part of our conscious awareness. So our conscious awareness is about 3 to 5% actually of our consciousness, our memory. And so the rest of it, you can imagine, right? 95 to 97% of what we know, what we think we know, what we don't know, is stuck in this this unconscious ball, if you will. And unless the part of your brain that is responsible for memory integration and recall is functioning, right? It doesn't happen. I can't wake up tomorrow and tell you what happened the day before if that part of my brain is not online. So that part of the brain, so the midbrain, is very, very important function of memory, integration, recall. So integration, we're thinking of this as not a mushing together and creating something new, maybe creating something new, but it's more of a linking of. It's a linking of what I knew with new information, and now I'm creating a new conclusion, or I've got a much more full story, or whatever the case might be. So integration is a linking up of. So the hippocampus is part of the midbrain, and it is largely responsible for memory integration and recall. And what happens during trauma, especially sudden traumatic events, is that entire region of the brain shuts down, right? So there's no integrative function of the hippocampal region, which means all of those implicit memories don't get processed. They get stuck in these implicit boxes. So those implicit boxes, right? So one of those boxes is going to hold my memory of the bear, but it's going to hold the memory of the bear in my emotions and in my body, not necessarily in my conscious awareness or even in my unconscious, something I can pull up voluntarily, but something that's stuck. It's not coming out until it's triggered to come out. Okay. So these are really important functions of the brain. So if you want good memory, first of all, get good sleep. And when there's trauma happening, just know that chances are you may not recall that event the way that it actually happened. You may not recall that the event actually ever happened until it gets triggered into actually happening. So when it comes to memory, it's important that that mid part of the brain is actually online. So another important function, oh, well, I'll tell you this real quick though, is the hippocampus actually, it does shrink, but there's also damage to the central nervous system and physical organs. And this is actually what brings it back to the ACEs, right? Where we had that neurobiological disruption. We've got all sorts of developmental issues and socialization problems. Other parts of the brain that are notably impacted is the amygdala. The amygdala is the emotional center. And actually the amygdala just kind of sits over top of I don't know if I can do it right, of the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is kind of down here, and they both have little bulbs, right? And they communicate with one another. Well, the amygdala becomes super overactive when there is a traumatic event. It's an emotional response. And if it continues to happen, the amygdala actually begins to expand. So what happens with the amygdala too is it's very interesting, but it actually shuts down the language center of the brain. So in extreme emotional distress, extreme, trauma events, and I say extreme, is some people's extreme is not extreme, and some people's extreme is like what would seem minor to somebody else. So keep that in mind. Your response to trauma has a lot to do with the factors around you, with your social support system and your attachment style and all of those things. So just keep that in mind. There's no defined scale that says, you know, this is trauma if this, this, and this happened to you. It's trauma if your body responded in a way that was traumatic, right? If your body shut down, if you went into the survival response, if you were not able to process those memories in a healthy way, in a safe environment, that kind of thing. So the amygdala shuts down what's called the Broca's area, the language center of the brain. So you're not able to actually form words and language to tell somebody what happened. Sometimes you can see it, you can feel it, you can experience it in a way where it feels like it's happening again, but there's no words to draw from. There's just no language. And it could be 2 hours from the event had happened or 20 years later, and there's still no language. And then the prefrontal cortex. So this is, you know, up here, this is our thinking brain, our evolved brain, if you will, the things that we, you know, draw logic and make decisions and all sorts of different things. The prefrontal cortex, especially in children who have been traumatized over time, the prefrontal cortex actually doesn't grow as well. So it's not that it necessarily shrinks, it just doesn't have the opportunity to connect all the wiring. So what's happening when trauma is happening, especially early on, it trains the brain, it conditions the brain to use the survival mechanisms in the brain. The survival mechanisms are basically in your midbrain and your brain stem, right? The things that keep you alive. And it doesn't necessarily get a chance to then develop the rest of your brain, you know, your logic, your language, things that make sense, putting together a story from beginning, middle to end. All of those things become inhibited. So when we talk about the growth of the prefrontal cortex being diminished, we see impulse control issues, learning, problem solving issues. It's associated with antisocial and aggressive behavior. And there actually have been studies that show there is a gender difference between how much the amygdala and prefrontal cortex are impacted depending on whether it is a male or female. So now keep in mind the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are both impacted in males and females, but to a greater degree, the amygdala is impacted more in females and the prefrontal cortex is impacted more in males. So, and we can kind of see where that happens, especially when we're dealing with children. And I think it's most notably probably in the foster care system. But even raising your own kids, right? Females seem to function more a little bit out of their amygdala, their emotional center, and boys more out of their prefrontal cortex. So, you know, their need for play and all of those things are vital. So I think that's as far as I'm going to go from here on this video, and we will pick it up next time with sort of I might show you the brain scans that are, actually I might show you that right now. So before we hop off here, I'm actually gonna share something really quick because I think this is super fun. So hopefully you can see that. I don't know if you can. There we go. So this here is a brain scan. And this was an individual who had been abused over time. And on the right-hand side, you see gaping holes where there should be activity. And the red area is where the majority of the activity is happening. So over here on the left, what you see is the majority of the activity happening in the prefrontal cortex, right? This is typical individuals walking around making decisions. You know, they're using a good portion of their brain most of the time. Over on the right-hand side, what you see is those who have been traumatized often just live out of that survival center, what we call the mammalian brain or primitive brain, whatever you want to call it. It's where that fight, flight, or freeze comes from, the autonomic nervous system and response. So that is the end of this video for today. I will come back at you with a little more of this trauma stuff and how it's linked to how child abuse is linked to impaired brain development, juvenile delinquency, all of those things. We might talk about predators because that'll be fun. Okay, so I will see you next time. Bye-bye.